Hi there, my name is Dennis Papadopoulos. I'm a PhD candidate in philosophy at York University, and today I'm going to be talking to you about rethinking shared intentionality in great apes. So my main question is, are great apes cooperating? And prima facie, the answer is yes. So great apes include humans, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans. But for the most part, I'll be focusing on humans, chimpanzees, and bonobos. And together, the great apes, all of them share food and territory, and chimpanzees especially also hunt together and in some cases patrol their territory, breaking into a smaller group and going around together. And there are, of course, other instances of potential cooperation here. But Michael Tomasello suggests that they're not really cooperating. These prima facie cooperative activities actually require a different kind of interpretation. They might be acting together without intending to act together or something else. So Tomasello argues that great apes don't have shared intentions. That's because he argues that shared intentions require third personal abstraction, and great apes lack this ability. I'm going to argue that third personal abstraction is not necessary for shared intentions. The same sort of work can be done by social norms, and that great apes are sensitive to those norms, to social norms. And if that's true, then that opens up the possibility of us interpreting all those prima facie cooperative activities as truly cooperative, as shared intentions. Something that Tomasello's model will rule out. So let's talk a little bit more about Tomasello's model, which I'm calling the role-playing model. So Tomasello says we need to start, or participants start with a shared goal. And then in order to achieve that goal, they need to understand interlocking roles. So they have to understand not just how they can pursue that goal, but how they require others to also perform something to pursue that goal. And he says that this has to be done by thinking outside of your own point of view, right? Getting to this abstraction away from you so that you can look down on the situation from a bird's eye view, as if you had a schematic of all the roles involved that in theory anyone could perform, and then dividing that task up, and then adopting one of those roles. So once you've adopted a role, the thing that makes it truly collaborative is that you also have to commit to supporting others in their role, right? So it could be the case that you adopt a role and pursue a goal, and others are also pursuing that goal, but you aren't really working together. And that wouldn't count. It's also possible that you're coordinating with someone, but you're really just using them as a social tool, and you don't have any commitment to help them also achieve the goal, or to achieve the goal together. And in order to have this commitment, you have to understand not just your role, but you have to understand their role so that you might be able to support them in their pursuit of that. And third personal abstraction seems necessary to understanding their role as well as yours and how those things fit together to pursue a joint goal. Okay. And he believes that great apes don't have third personal abstraction because they fail to complete role reversal tasks. So role reversal tests the understanding of cooperative tasks because if you're in a cooperative situation and you understand not only your role, but how your role fits in with another participant's role, then you're understanding the task collaboratively. You're understanding it from that third personal point of view where you and another are working together to achieve something. But if you only understand your role, then maybe you're not really working together. Maybe the other person is just a social tool that you're using and predicting in order to accomplish something on your own. And Tomasello has studied this a number of ways, but one of the results was that chimpanzees, when they've been trained to do one part of a collaborative task and they're allowed to perform the other part, they have to learn the other part as if they were approaching it for the first time. So even if they're used to having a partner that does something, when they're put in that position, the partner's position, they don't seem to learn that any faster than they would had they had no previous experience. So it seems like they're not able to reverse the roles. When they're performing any role, they don't really understand what the other person is doing. So they don't seem to think about their collaborative tasks from this third personal point of view, this bird's eye view. Now, on this model, there's been conflicting observations, right? So Christoph Beuys suggests that chimps can do this, and they do, and that their hunting is one of the ways they do this. So when chimps hunt monkeys, one of the chimps will sort of charge, the monkeys will start to run, and then the other chimps will either chase or try to cut them off, depending on their particular role. And Christoph Beuys suggests that there's a number of these roles that we can identify, and all the chimps understand that by performing these different roles, they can collaboratively have a more successful hunt than otherwise. Henrik Moll and Tomasello suggest that mostly when we watch chimps in these hunting situations, it's very chaotic, and that any roles that they seem to be playing is largely an ascription by us. They suggest that all the chimps in these situations are acting opportunistically, and they might seem to behave differently depending on where they are relative to the monkeys when the monkeys start to scatter. So what we have here is almost any ecologically valid activity that looks cooperative is going to be amenable to multiple interpretations, either collaboratively or not collaboratively. Okay, so on my model, we don't have to prefer a non-collaborative interpretation. We can prefer collaborative interpretations because my model isn't going to rely on this third personal abstraction. So my model draws loosely from Margaret Gilbert. Of course, she's only speaking about humans, so I need to modify it a little bit to make room for non-human animals. And so we have to start by having participants recognize a pattern of coordinated behavior, which I'm going to call a social norm. And participants have to mutually express a willingness to follow that norm. And that allows them, once others have expressed their willingness to follow a norm, that allows them to expect those others to follow that norm, right? We expect others to do what they started doing or what they communicated that they were willing to do. And each participant is going to follow this norm contingent upon others following it as well. So they all express a willingness to follow it, but whether or not that actually gets carried out depends upon all the others actually carrying it out as well. Okay. So the first problem with this idea is that humans can understand norms in a way that non-human animals can't, right? So Laura Schlinghoff and Richard Moore suggest that we must know a rule is present in order for us to be following that rule. And there are ways that humans can know a rule is present and identify rules and articulate rules that other great apes just can't. But John Searle, talking only about humans, sets the bar for knowing a rule very low, right? He suggests that what we have to know is how to act according to a rule, whether or not we can articulate that rule. And he suggests that there's a number of social conventions that might be difficult for us to articulate, but easy to follow. And if that's all that's meant by knowing a rule, maybe there's space for animals to know a rule enough to know how to interact with it. So Kristen Andrews suggests several criteria for social norms in non-human animals, and for that matter, in human animals. So first, an agent that's capable of abiding by social norms has to be able to identify other agents, right? You have to know who else is part of that norm. Then they have to be sensitive to in-group and out-group differences, right? If you're doing something with a group, you have to know who's a member of that, right? There has to be an articulation of who's the we when we're doing something. Okay, and then they have to be able to pick up on relevant patterns of behavior as opposed to irrelevant ones relating to a task that you're doing or a group that you're in. And then they have to be able to distinguish appropriate from inappropriate behavior in both social context and situation. Okay, so the first two are fairly uncontroversial. It seems like most people believe that great apes can identify other agents, and great apes understand in-group and out-group differences. The other two get a little bit more problematic. Are they picking up on relevant behavior, and can they distinguish appropriate from inappropriate behavior? So building on that a little bit, and going back to my criteria that they have to be able to mutually express something, in a collaborative context, can apes communicate in order to make that collaboration happen, right? If they can, that means that they have some understanding that they are collaborating, some recognition of what's a relevant behavior here, and some ability to express a willingness to collaborate by communicating back and forth. So Alicia Mellis and Tomasello did an experiment where two chimpanzees were trained on a puzzle box. This puzzle box requires them to collaborate. They each need to use one tool in the puzzle box so that they can unlock it, and both of them get food. And so the two chimps are kept in two rooms with a barrier and the box is in between. And they need two tools. Each of them needs one of them to actually unlock this box. Both of the tools are hidden. In the experimental case, they're hidden in a box that only one of the chimps has access to. There's another box that doesn't have any tools in it. So the chimp that has access, in theory, to the boxes doesn't know which one has the tools, doesn't know that there are tools in them. Another chimp on the other side can see the tools. The box is transparent on the one side. And that chimp has a key that unlocks the box. So the chimp that can see the tools takes the key, puts it on top of the box. The other chimp sees the key, uses the key to open the box, gets the tools, gives one of the tools to the other chimp, and then they collaboratively open the box. Right? By passing tools back and forth, they facilitated the communication necessary to initiate and realize their collaborative task. So it seems they are able to express a mutual willingness, and they are able to identify and predict relevant behaviors. Okay, so how do we know that they can tell the appropriate from inappropriate behaviors? Right? In the experimental suggestion, it might be a little too easy to do that. There's only so many relevant behaviors, and they're trained on one of them. So Margaret Gilbert thinks this standing to rebuke is a really important part of normativity in shared intentions in humans. And standing to rebuke is the idea that when we're collaborating, you've expressed that you're going to do something, and I expect you to do that thing, and if you don't do what I expect you to do, well, I can complain about it. And Schlinghoff and Moore suggest that because we fail to see this in non-human animals, for the most part, we see it very rarely. Maybe there's not a good reason to think that they know that they're following a rule, because they don't seem to impose that on the other participants and their other group members. Well, I'm not sure that standing to rebuke is really going to be so clear-cut, because the standing to rebuke might be necessary, but the actual rebuke really isn't. There's lots of situations, even in human society, where actually rebuking someone, especially if they have more power than you in a situation, is not the appropriate or right thing for you to do. Right? Rebuking others has costs. And this is maybe especially true in complex dominance hierarchies where there's a threat of violence that a lot of chimpanzees live in, right? And for that matter, a lot of other great apes. So Claudia Rudolph von Rohr and her colleagues have observed that at least sometimes high-ranking males in a community will break up fights in order to keep the peace. And they don't pick one of the sides. It's not an affiliative relationship where they like one and not the other. They're just trying to maintain this peaceful norm. And because they're a high-ranking male, there isn't a lot of cost that they're incurring by doing this. So maybe in the cases where there aren't a lot of costs, they can do that. And we might get further into this, that there's a lot of problems with experiments on this account because the chimps have complicated relationships, right? They might only share or collaborate with their affiliates, their friends, their family, the ones that they're close to. They might be less inclined to do that when dominance hierarchies, power structures in their own community, or just whether or not they like each other gets involved. So because their social situation is so complicated and so different, it's hard to see when they would rebuke. But they do sometimes rebuke, And that's a suggestion that maybe they often have standing to rebuke even when they don't actually rebuke. Okay. So here's my plausible example. What I hope is going to sound like a shared intention on my normative model here. So bonobos sometimes share territories and forage together, which is a little bit weird, right? They're very closely related to chimpanzees, and chimpanzees have very antagonistic relationships with their neighboring communities. So bonobos sharing the territory is interesting. It starts out when they first encounter each other. Two groups foraging separately encounter each other in the part of their territory that's shared, and it starts out tense, right? They have that same inclination that other great apes would have, and they'll vocalize more aggressively, and sometimes that's it, and then they part ways. Other times, the females from one group will go over to the other side and greet and fraternize with the unfamiliar group. And sometimes this might be because those females are actually familiar with that other group, right? Because the females sometimes immigrate from one group to another, so young females in one group might remember individuals in the other group. So they go over and greet and fraternize with them, and that starts to diffuse the situation a little bit. The bonobo males, gradually as this happens, sort of calm down. The territorial tension is eased. They make, at first, very aggressive vocalizations, perhaps intended to convince the females not to fraternize with the other group. But eventually those stop. And there's a new norm, a norm of mutual tolerance. And of course it's mutual, because as soon as any one of them got too aggressive, the tolerating each other would end, right? Either because there would be some sort of actual violence, or because they just part ways. So it's interdependent in the relevant way. And it's been communicated, right? It gradually is communicated over time as the tensions ease, as the vocalizations stop, as both groups start to relax. And this means they understand that the other group is relaxing. In fact, their relaxing is dependent upon the other group relaxing. And so they establish a new norm, a norm that wasn't there in the first place. In the first place, they start with tension, and that tension is eased gradually through witnessing each other and coming to expect something different from each other, coming to expect they will be tolerated. And as a result, they actually forage together for a while before the groups peacefully break apart. And go back to their relative territories. So I hope that this sounds like they're sharing the intention to forage together, right? They were foraging alone, they meet each other, they don't immediately have this, it's not automatic, they develop that by communicating and mutually expressing these things. Okay, so my conclusion here is that if my normative model is plausible, and the case I proposed is plausible, even if it's not a sure thing, then the necessity of third personal abstraction in the role-playing model isn't a necessity, right? It's one way that you can establish a commitment, and there are others, and it may not be even the most common way humans establish commitments, right? I don't normally think of the activities that I'm doing when I'm collaborating with someone from a third personal point of view. I don't have that bird's eye view schematic, right? I think that what I'm doing is much more like the normative account in most cases. So if third personal abstraction is not necessary, then we don't need to rule out cooperative explanations of prima facie cooperative behaviors. When it looks like a chimpanzee or another great ape or a bonobo is cooperating, well, maybe that's what's happening. Maybe they are just cooperating. All right, thank you for your time.